Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very, very good morning to you. Thank you for joining this particular In Conversation With series. Today, we're going to be looking at natural capital and the economics of biodiversity. I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, and I'll be discussing his report that he has recently issued. It was a report that was commissioned by the Treasury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and it was launched earlier this year. Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta is the Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge, and he's been a Professor of Economics since 1985, serving as the Chairman of the Faculty of Economics from 1997 to 2001. Partha has won numerous awards, and in 2002 was knighted by the Queen for services to economics. The review that Partha has written has prompted by a growing body of evidence that in recent decades, humanity has been degraded and impacted on our most precious asset, which is nature itself. And a statistic that jumped out of the report to me was that between 1992 and 2014, we've seen a global decline in natural capital by 40%. These are issues that I'm going to be discussing with Partha in our discussion, and I'm going to have about half an hour of question and answer session with Partha, and then we'll open the floor to a Q&A session. If you could be kind and put your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, please use Q&A rather than chat. I'll take those questions after the main In Conversation With session. So, without any further ado, I'm going to ask Partha if he could be kind and join the floor. Partha, thank you very, very much indeed for agreeing to participate and discuss your review, which has been extremely well received by certainly our organization and many other organizations across the UK and also globally.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. If I could ask a very sort of general question to start with, why do you feel it was important to write a report about economics and biodiversity? And do you think the relationship between the economy and the natural world is broken? And perhaps for those of us who aren't quite at the same level of economics as you, you might explain some of the basic terminology that you've used within the report.
Well, thank you very much. You've asked two questions, and I'll start with the second of the two, which is that, yes, there is a deep sense in which contemporary economics treats nature as external to the human economy. And the motivation underlying the review, pretty much a few months after I agreed to write it, I realized that what I really needed to do was to write a review of the economics or reconstruct economics to, in a way in which that embeds the human economy in nature rather than keeping it external. And I'll try and make that clear as briefly as I can. So that's a second, in other words, there is a big divide between the way economists think of the human economy, contemporary economics, that is, think of the human economy and nature. So therefore, of course, the answer to the first question is immediately yes, there is a need for this. it should be remember that my review is really not about biodiversity. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. The review is a review of the economics of the biosphere. You know, the whole of nature. Okay, and we are embedded in it. We are part of nature. Now, this might seem just words, but I want you to appreciate that, and I want listeners to appreciate that the models that, say, the Treasury uses to forecast future demand and supplies and financial requirements, and the models that academics produce in the economic sphere. And these two are deeply embedded in each other for a good reason, and thank God they are, otherwise there'll be two different universes. These models do not have nature as an essential part of our human economy. Now, the way to think about nature is, at least from the perspective of the review, is to think of ecosystems as the unit of account. And of course, they vary enormously, spatially, as well as the speed of the processes that drive them. That's for sure. But you could say the same thing about machines. Different machines have different characteristics. So we're looking at capital assets, and these are ecosystems. Land, but land is too generic a term. We want to think about, say, wetlands, mangrove forests, and so forth, okay? And the idea is that you treat such assets on a par, and treat them, in fact, as fundamental to the production of other assets, such as machines, roads, buildings, produced capital, that is, and human capital, education, health. Standard models of economics take produced capital and human capital extremely seriously, but regard nature, roughly speaking, and I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much, as an infinite supply out there from which we can draw and then create and invest and make lives flourish. The problem is that over the past 70 years, what we have done is to have accumulated human capital and produced capital at an astonishing pace, so that we live a very good life on average now. I'm talking in average terms globally. But at the expense of natural capital, we have degraded. So what we have done is essentially mine nature and convert it into the stuff that we buy and sell. So that's, roughly speaking, what the review is about. Is it asks us to, in investment projects, considering human future possibilities, to regard ecosystems very much as assets that we should nurture, invest in, and so forth. And the reason, and it tries to explain why we haven't done so. And that, of course, has to do with institutional failure writ large. Market failure, some people call it. Namely, much of nature is free, whereas it shouldn't be, so we don't cost it, so we overuse it, and so forth. The rest of it sort of follows common sense, but the idea really is to sharpen that common sense into a rigorous form, so that government models can be modified, very, in fact, drastically changed, to bring nature into account, and academic research as well.
So, in fact, to build on that, the figure I mentioned earlier, the decline in natural capital by 40%, that was 40% over, I think, a 20-year period. That's between 1992 and 2014. And by contrast, the two other capitals that you have explained, produced capital per person doubled, and human capital per person increased by 13% globally. So there's a huge imbalance. And I was very interested in that imbalance that you quite rightly picked on, and the brokenness of effectively the economy. So I suppose, because in general economists tend to, as you say, monetize items, how do we best get a standardization for monetizing natural capital? Because it's really quite difficult. And in the land space sector that we're in and our members are in, as we move from the Common Agricultural Policy that presently was paying us X pounds per hectare of land, to a payment that we're going to get under environmental land management, which is going to recognize a payment for public goods. That's going to move us towards picking up payments towards these ecosystem services that you mentioned. How do you feel we can best measure natural capital, best monetize it, and come up with a standard way within this country and also globally?
Right, of course, it's the million-dollar question, because that's saying it's going to be impossible to answer in a brief. But let me give you a sort of sense of how to think about it. That's the best I can do. First of all, when somebody says monetizing nature, it immediately sends alarm bells to many people. You know, it's like tarnishing nature and so forth. So I wouldn't use the word monetized. That's just a unit of account. That's how we express things. But what we want to do is to value it in comparison with other things. When I say it, I mean ecosystem services with other things, like the services that your refrigerator produces, supplies to you at your home. Because that's a capital good and you've bought it, there's a market for it. And the trouble is that ecosystem services go unpriced in large measure, not all, but in large measure. The tension that has arisen, is even in the CLA community in some sense, is the fact, it comes out of the fact that nature supplies us with what ecologists call provisioning services: food, timber, clean water, fiber, the stuff that we buy and sell. Those things have markets once they're produced, okay? But Mother Nature also supplies us with what people call, ecologists call, maintenance and regulating services, such as, for example, climate regulation, pollination, sequestration of nitrogen. These are much more intangible. They're very often silent. They're also invisible. So you can imagine that they're extremely hard to nail down, and certainly the market system doesn't nail it down. Moreover, nature is mobile. So of course, what you do at your land eventually in due course will affect not just your adjacent properties, but land elsewhere. And what I do with my plastic can end up in the outreaches of the Pacific Ocean. So that causes real difficulties, and trying to internalize those effects is what the art of good economics is, okay? Now, at the first cut, we might want to think of nature as supplying us with useful services, those that are beneficial to us as humans, okay? They're called, so the use value of nature. And it's the use value I'm talking about now. How does, for example, a wetland contribute to nurturing life forms which help in pollination? Adjacent properties, farmland, for example. How does a wetland clean water? And if it didn't clean water, what would the urban population have to do in order to have the water cleaned? That would require building a produced capital to clean it, okay? So there is an alternative way of doing it. The question is, which is cheaper? That's one question we may want to ask. So we want to think about the productivity of ecosystems in terms of these silent processes that they generate. Now, the market may not pick it up, but a good scientist and a good farmer and with the help of a good economist could surely try and estimate those values. Because what you want to do is to ask what happens, for example, if you cut through a wetland and create a road system, all right? The road is supposed to bring benefits, and probably does. And that part we can easily measure because, you know, the governments are pretty used to doing that kind of calculation. But you then want to ask what's the loss owing to the partitioning of the the wetland. All right. And so that's where we come back to the question I've just asked. What are the services that it provided or provides, which will be curtailed or diminished? And then you want to balance the two. Now, what the review does is to show pretty unambiguously that even if you take the minimalist attitude towards nature, namely that it only has use value, we are way off base, and that we really have to invest in the ecosystems that we have degraded, restore them, and protect the ones we haven't yet killed. Right to the world. I mean, there are some, and of course, this all can be done in a disciplined way. The thinking can be done in a disciplined way to tropical rainforests, mangrove, peatlands, and so forth. Okay, you can do that. And of course, they differ from place to place, time to time, and so forth. So again, the valuation problem really becomes difficult, but it's doable along the lines that I've just now mentioned. So you really need to have ecologists that work with you. You need to have hydrologists that work with you. You need some economists as well to be able, because they know, we do know how to think about these things in the production sense. Okay. So it's going to be rough, tough kind of work. These are all approximate because you don't have even a first cut at the prices, because there are zero prices in many cases. And in some, they are negatively priced because we subsidize the use of nature to the tune of about $4 to $6 trillion a year globally. So we have been paying ourselves to eat into nature in order to be able to have food and these provisioning services which we care about. So there's a conflict between these provisioning services on the one hand and the maintenance and regulating services on the other, and the provisioning services have been winning it. So it's not really so much a country, city, town divide. It's a divide within the countryside. Because we care about the provisioning service. We want to be rich. We want to leave that, feed ourselves well and travel and so forth. All that, those are the provisioning services. But they require, if you like, at the base, these regulating and maintenance services. For example, decaying, degradation of waste. That's something that's rarely ever discussed. And the review does a lot of that. It discusses a lot, because if you ignore that, you forget what services nature provides us, these silent services. So for example, if crows were not to be there or vultures were to disappear, you would have just the carcasses all over the place. Okay? So the cleansing process of nature is something that we tend to forget. So I think that tension is there. But once you notice that there is a tension, there's something you can do about it. We're living with tension elsewhere all the time. I want this, I want that, but I can't have both, so I have to make a choice. So getting a balance requires of us to do this valuation. And that's what you're asking. And it can be done, and it is being done. There are lots and lots of studies that have tried to see the productivity of investment in nature. Green investment, as we call it now, I suppose.
No, thank you. Well, of course, you've raised so many issues within that. I mean, I was fascinated by what you highlighted as the imbalance between our demands and nature's supply, and you've termed it an impact inequality, which actually is a really useful phrase. And you pick up on plastic, which Sir David Attenborough has had a big campaign, and it's hit the general public very much. It's been a very emotive campaign. It's been very well received. And when we look towards solutions, and as you quite rightly said, we need to look at waste as well. And you talked about soil, and I talked about the benefit of worms and the huge benefit that they give to our soil, improving fertility as well as managing waste. When we look across globally, you quoted some really big numbers, and the numbers are so big that I can't really get my head around. But we have issues within the rainforest, mangrove swamps, as you quite rightly say, and then actually bring it back to the UK itself with peatland, woodland, and how we manage our soils. How do you feel that individuals can best become involved in this? We've touched on waste. The government is quite rightly, through the Committee on Climate Change, putting out messages, and the Prime Minister has put out his message of his 30-30, which is 30% of the land area should be protected by 2030. He's analysed the issue of climate change and come down to a sort of 10-point code. But how do you feel that institutions can cope? Because you quite rightly, within your paper, talk about institutional failure and institutional breakdown of markets. How can we as individuals and members of our association bring ourselves into the review and the issues that you speak about in your paper?
Really, another tough question. Okay, this is one of those things which it's very simple to comprehend once it's brought out into the open. So I'm doing something which affects you, and you're doing something which affects me, and we're looking at a case where it does so adversely, not in the sense in which we're beneficial to each other. We're adversely affecting each other. It could be through climate, carbon emission. It could be through soil degradation. You name it. Okay. All right. Now, you and I are good people, maybe, but that's not the point. The point is that we do also have some obligations to our own self and our families or company that we represent and so forth. That's there. So there is a tension here between recognizing that we could do something collectively which will benefit both of us by exercising restraint, let's say, but which neither of us has an incentive to do on his own, because that incentive is not there, because part of it is benefit to somebody else. Okay, that is namely, in my case, you, and you, in your case, me. So what would pure reasoning suggest? That we should get together and say, how do we construct an arrangement, create an arrangement whereby actually we get penalized for, to some extent, for the damage each of us inflicts on the other by his or her action. Okay, because if we do that, then we both benefit. That's the standard reason for negotiation. After all, when people get together to negotiate, they look for a zone of choice where both parties can benefit. If they find one and then agree that that's the fair one, then all is well. But if they can't find it, or pretend that they can't, or if they can't agree, then they fall back to the original situation, and the situation reverts itself in the way it was. Okay, so what does this tell us about the question you've asked? It tells us that farmers should together lobby governments to impose restrictions on their activities, and impose restrictions and payments also. I mean, alter the institutional arrangement, which will make farmers behave differently, because ultimately it'll be in the collective interest to do so. When you talked about payments for ecosystem services, which is quite a common institutional arrangement that replaces the market. Some say that is the market, but these are play of words. Okay, so it's payment for ecosystem services, which are quite common now in Costa Rica, increasingly in China and elsewhere, and beginning to be here. That's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about. There are some benefits that you're conferring as a landowner on your neighbors, and you will take more care of your asset, capital asset, the natural capital that you have, if you are compensated for that benefit, because that's a service that your asset is conferring, but you're not grabbing it. And so your incentive to preserve your asset is that much attenuated. So that's the way to do it. For the general public, I mean, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the first thing we should do is to lobby collectively, government, to take nature seriously. And you were describing some aspects of that kind of move within the UK now, as articulated by a prime minister. That's for sure. But of course, there's huge numbers of countries where there's nothing remotely like this sense of urgency. So now you have a problem that UK is just one amongst many, many countries, and you can't be expected to solve the world's problems. So the incentive the UK has is also attenuated in a world in which most others aren't behaving. So we now have moved to an international order, if you like. Nations ought to. And of course, COP26 and COP15, which will take place this year, later this year in Scotland and China, respectively, are designed to do that. The only problem I have with them is that they really haven't introduced in their thinking the creation of international institutions that are now urgently, in my judgment, are required for handling the global public goods that we enjoy from the tropical rainforests, from the oceans, open oceans, the atmosphere, and so forth. Now you might say, well, the atmosphere is always under consideration because COP26 is supposed to be concerned with climate change. But notice it's not concerned with an international institution. It doesn't talk about it. It talks about each country committing itself. And the question is, how does the commitment translate into enforceable action? And because it's not enforceable up to now, Paris has been a dead failure, if you see what I mean. So yes, we have to work at every end. But finally, there's at the personal level. I mean, I suggested that we individuals ought to collectively lobby, that's for sure, because this is something that requires public action, collective action. But at the individual level, we do have a huge responsibility to ourselves. We're part of nature. And when we desecrate nature, we ought to recognize we're doing so and feel bad about it, because if you don't feel bad about it, you will do it if nobody's actually penalizing you for it. So the review concludes with a plea for reform of the education system that from the earliest years, particularly in an increasingly urbanized society, we ought to learn something about how nature works. You know, messing around in the ground soil, as kids usually used to do, at least my generation did. And if you learn something about the mysteries of nature, you tend to have respect for it.
Well, I'm going to sort of ask my sort of final question in this round, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So if those watching who are participating in the webinar today would like to pose a question, please do it through the Q&A session, and I'll aim to pick up as many as I can. But just going back to your comment about COP15, which is the biodiversity conference of the parties, and COP26, which is the Convention on Climate Change, you quite rightly say that you feel, and you state in your report, there should be a new and ambitious direction for the future decade. And I think it's trying, as you say, to get that urgency within governments across the globe to actually do something. I'm interested in now in your views on how a number of work streams are coming together and whether you're thinking they're working positively together, and then what reaction you had from government. So firstly, how you felt the reaction that government put out to your specific paper. Secondly, your thoughts about the very recent National Food Strategy that Henry Dimbleby has written, which our association has commented and many other people have picked up upon. And then also work that Sir Dieter Helm has been doing on natural capital, and his thoughts and propositions that the polluters should pay, and maybe there should be a carbon tax and how that will be implemented. And I guess finally, to bring in the private market, we're doing work with the Broadway Initiative and work on green finance, but also Mark Carney has been tasked to look at voluntary carbon markets, particularly the private sector, with PLCs being involved with their ESG requirements in their reporting. So, and it's a rather a sort of large global question, but I wonder whether you feel that actually things are beginning to slowly move in the right direction.
Well, I think they are. at least in the UK, there are, I would be able to say, in other countries. As regards to your first question, the Treasury put out a response brief a couple of months ago to the review. Very extensive. It was extremely positive. No, I had nothing but pleasure reading it. That was not a problem. It's taken pretty much all recommendations on board. Question is, I have no idea whether it'll be translated into policy. So that's first question. I think things are moving. Certainly, the Natural Capital Committee was designed to try and put value to various forms of ecosystems, a issue that I covered in the previous question of yours. And he's trying to systematize it for this country, procedures for doing that. It's almost like asking the statistical office of a country to redo its statistical basis, the information that it collects and coheres into small numbers to be able to get a sense of what the state of the economy is. And I think that's good. It's there are many different ways of doing it. That's just in valuing nature and then aggregating them, okay? Because you're trying to put together sums. Many countries are doing it now. China is a leader in that. New Zealand is one. Costa Rica is one, and we are another. So that's moving in. There's going to be a lot of disagreement for a while, but that's okay. That's fine. I mean, people disagreed about how to compute national income, by the way, only 40, 50 years ago, and it's still an ongoing project. So that's not an issue. We've got to get it, as good, well as we can. The creation, giving incentives for investing in nature, I think in a sense I've covered it because the incentives are very low at the moment, small because of all these missing markets. So there's no payoff, no returns on investing in nature is low if the fruits of that investment are priced at zero. So why would we invest? So, the economics of that is pretty clear. The design of the incentive systems are not that easy, of course. So payment for ecosystem services is a very good institution in principle because it gives a clear signal to the owners of the asset as to what kind of investment will bring profits. Okay. Regarding the carbon markets, I have a slight problem, more than a slight problem actually, in that it's the economics of climate change is really, I know it sounds a difficult one, but it's actually a very simple one in the way it's been framed. It sees climate regulation as the single service that nature provides. I'm not exaggerating. Climate models are about the climate, about how carbon concentration translates into the climate system. And then you try and estimate, a sea level rise or forest frequency of storms, floods, and so forth and so on. Okay, and then you try and cost those, and you regard those as damages, and you want to prevent them, and so you take investment activity, essentially adaptation activities now. All right. The problem is that climate regulation is one of the many other regulations, the services that Mother Nature provides. I mentioned that before. It was those regulating and provisioning services. Now, here's something that I think your audience would like to know. They know it, of course. You all know it. It's just that I'm trying to remind you of it. Is that these services are complementary to one another. They're not substitutes. You can't say I'm going to have more pollination at the expense of climate regulation. They hang together. It's almost like a house of cards. Each card in a house of cards is complement to the other. So you remove one and think topples. Now, nature isn't a house of cards for sure, because it's robust, it's resilient, and so forth. You know this better than I do, even, because you live with that. But remember, we are countering nature by humans, and we are damn clever now. And if we put our mind to it, we can destroy nature. So yes, it can be made into a house of cards, and that's what we're trying to prevent. The problem with carbon markets is that in the general scheme of things, an ecosystem, a unit of biomass in the rainforest of Brazil is different from a unit of biomass in the tundra. And if you start having markets for biomass, then you could have you could play havoc the system could be really bad news for nature, if you see what I mean. And of course, even a unit of biomass in the Amazon means nothing, because the Amazon is it's a biome. So it depends on where it is located. So location matters because it fits in with other units of biomass to create the ecosystem that we're studying. That's why in my review, I don't talk about markets for biomass. The unit of account is not biomass. The unit of account is ecosystem services, and ecosystems as the asset which generates them, and then we work backwards from that.
Now, Partha, that's really helpful. Now, I've got a difficult task here. So far, I've got 11 questions to cover in the remaining 25 odd minutes.
One sentence answers, okay.
So I'm going to have a go at this, and I'm just going to carry on this concept of markets, because Charlie Burrell has asked a question, and one of the case studies that you put in your paper is based on his estate, which you picked up on down at NEP. And he's asking, he's commented on the carbon markets, and we've looked at that, and we've talked about ecosystems. But he specifically asked about biodiversity credits, because we're being forced effectively by the Environment Bill to look towards biodiversity net gain. And the question really is, do you think that farmers and landowners can come up with a biodiversity bank to effectively establish credits, which could then be used by accredited companies in the similar concept to this voluntary carbon markets that's appearing, that you've quite rightly explained you don't think necessarily would work because of the differential between it? And how is it going to help by looking at biodiversity loss? And attached to that, there's a rather sensible question which you may or may not answer, or perhaps could duck, with Lisa Craig Griffin, which says that do you think that the government, UK government, is actually taking the recovery of nature seriously?
Right. I'll be very hard pressed to answer the second question, because I'm not that attuned to day-to-day government policy. I read what's being claimed and what's being promised, but there are lots of good signs of civil society working in harness with local authorities to invest in nature. Trumpington Meadows here in my neighborhood is an extremely good example of a shared partnership between farmers and builders, house builders, residential builders, and NGOs. The basic question, yes, the answer is yes. I think in principle, it can be done. The question of having these credits, carbon credits, or ecosystem, what was the expression, biodiversity. The thing is, I would, on the whole, avoid talking about biodiversity, because it's not clear what we mean by it. Are we talking about species diversity? Are we talking about the composition of an ecosystem, the diversity of the composition of the ecosystem, so what? And that's one reason my review talks about biodiversity to begin with, and shows that biodiversity in some deep sense raises the productivity of an ecosystem, the more diverse it is, but it's not clear what particular aspect of diversity we're talking about, and which is one reason why the review talks about the services the ecosystem provides. So if you think of assets in the same way as you do assets like buildings and roads and so forth, you ask yourself, what would be the rate of return on investing in that asset? Now, in the case of natural capital, investment may mean simply waiting. It may not require much heavy-duty work. You plant a seed and let it grow. And that's waiting, but it can be very productive. And the idea is to tease out ways to estimate those gains, those returns. Once you do that, then sure, you could in principle have a system where the private owner said, look, the price of this is low, in fact negligible, I'm not going to be investing in it. But if you like, I will invest in it, but then I'd like to be paid for it. It will be straightforward. It's cost-benefit analysis, as farmers do all the time. So I think I would rather think about it along the lines of suggesting that we think of ecosystems as capital assets and think of investment in them in the same way as we do investment in other things, except for the fact that the background picture of investment here is very different. It's not lathes, it's not bulldozers. It may be just letting the peatland recover. And that recovery, the benefits of the recovery, would not necessarily be picked up by the person who is allowing it to recover because it's in his private property. But the idea would be he should be able to be paid for it and have that promise from, say, the government, or in some cases, it could be an NGO, as we now increasingly see how NGOs do that, and from public contributions. That's another way of, these are all investment activities, but they have a different flavor. So I don't know if that is sort of response adequate to the question, but I would, on the whole, think of this as arrangements by which the investor reaps a benefit from that investment, which currently he or she does not.
No, thank you. I've got a question from our past president, Tim Brightmeyer, who's looking at the, if you like, the revenue outcome from the natural capital that we've discussed, and the goods that come from the natural capital. And the two particular items that he raises are food and water. And he comments that they're currently in this country very cheap. And he notes that if we're going to manage the environment in the way that we've discussed this morning,
yep,
those costs, the costs of those two particular products that he highlights, should actually go up when you look at the economics of it. But of course, when you look at some of the arrangements that the government, particularly the Department for International Trade, are looking at the moment in going overseas with their free trade agreements, and the issue of importing of products such as food, that's going to have an impact. And could it end up having a deleterious impact on our natural environment in this country, but also end up exporting some of those biodiversity and climate change issues overseas?
Thank you very much. That's extremely interesting. It also reminds me of the fact that I overlooked to respond to one part of your multifaceted question at the end, which is about the Dimbleby report. I think in some ways this question is related to Henry Dimbleby's report that came out a couple of months ago, which I thought was in large measure terrific. It saw the picture, it sort of embedded the food problem within the review's picture of natural capital, or the human economy, and suggested, essentially analyze the food problem along the lines of the question, the way the question has been posed here. So there are missing ingredients during the production of food in the pricing system. So food is too cheap. Now, if you include the subsidies, energy subsidies, fertilizer subsidies, and so forth, that throughout the world that I mentioned, of course, it means food is that much cheaper. And it's indicated by the fact, and it might sound odd to say that when people go hungry around here, even in this country, but it's not odd because that's a distributional issue, and we can talk about that too. But the fact is, we're wasting about a third of our food that's produced. So if it's that much waste, it must mean that we can afford to waste it, which is another way of saying food is very cheap. So the question is exactly right. These missing ingredients, these missing services that we are using to produce food means that food is too cheap. Okay, what about the exporting country? The question is a very nice one for the reason that it'll allow me to pontificate about something that really is bothering me these days, which is, it is not an accident that the richest if you like, the most productive ecosystems in the world in terms of the maintenance and regulating services I keep on mentioning are in the tropics, rich in biodiversity, another way of putting it. And it's not an accident also that the tropics are also where the poorest countries happen to be. They're supplying primary products to us, to the rest of the world. Okay, so let's talk about poor countries and rich countries, and they're exporting primary products, which through a long chain, supply chain, ends up in the supermarket, food or whatever. Okay. Now, out there, for a variety of reasons, there are again bad institutions, and some of them are aggressively bad because there are bad governments out there, lots of them. Okay, so let's forget that. So the price at which the primary products are exported are lower, possibly far lower than the cost that's borne by the people in those countries, for the same reason that we've been discussing all through. So let's say you deforest in the uplands, in the upstream, deforestation for exporting timber, for which there's high demand in rich countries, but of course that is endangering the productivity of downstream farmers, fishermen, and so forth. Now that reduction in productivity downstream is not captured in the price at which the product is being exported because they're not being compensated. So the import price is too low relative to the cost to those countries, which is another way of saying those countries are losing wealth and transferring wealth without our noticing it to rich countries. Now, if you put it that way, it sounds absurd. It sounds extremely unfair, not right. And this is not a conspiratorial theory. I'm simply saying this is what happens when you have missing markets. This is exactly what happens. So yes, one reason companies, importing companies in this part of the world are increasingly worried, at least for the conversations I've had, is precisely that the ecosystems there are threatened and they're the source of the primary products. So it comes back to the point we were discussing earlier, that it's in the interest of the companies here to lobby, to have themselves regulated, to try and see that the ecosystems from which they're importing goods are not trashed. Where at the individual level, you may say, well, you know, this is going to be trashed in 5 years' time, and by then I will have retired, why do I care? But these are interrelated problems, and I'm very glad that this question was asked. It's a deep question of international development.
And going on from that, I'm going to try and combine about 3 questions because they are in a way interrelated. One is an informational question from Jeff Duck, which is about the Treasury. Just wondering whether the Treasury Green Book can be rewritten to make sure that projects tested through the Green Book now produce the correct answer. I guess the question is what's correct. And Kate Duck, maybe they're related, asks about population and the issue of population growth and whether you think, as you touched on earlier on, whether globally we're going to end up with sufficient food to feed the population. And Marion asks, I guess it's an educational point, as to can we become better educated effectively to realize this and I suppose control population levels, be aware of population levels so that we end up feeding the right people in the right place, I suppose, is the question.
The review is, I have a feeling it's unique in having taken population extremely seriously. You talked about the impact inequality, which to those who haven't looked at the review yet, is simply relating the aggregate demand humanity makes on Mother Nature in terms of the services that we consume, and compares that with the ability of the biosphere to supply those match those demands on a sustainable basis. And what Mark was alluding to was that the gap between the demand and supply is huge now. In fact, the ratio of demand to supply is of the order of 1.6 to 1.7, from which you get the rhetoric that you need 1.6 or 1.7 Earths to meet the provisioning services that I was talking about. Okay, and we don't have an extra 0.6 or 0.7 Earths, so we have a problem here. And the review also decomposes the aggregate demand into the factors that lead to the aggregate demand. And let me mention just the three that we harness on. One is population, of course. Second is the average use of average income, if you like, of people. So that the product of the two is global GDP. And of course, you need also it depends on the extent to which the efficiency with which Mother Nature's services are converted into GDP. All right. So these three factors affect the demand side. And on the right-hand side is the supply, which we have been discussing so far, which is investment and in nature and so forth to boost up the supply. So on the demand side, the population is extremely important, and yet it's completely ignored in international development discourses for a variety of reasons which I do not understand and never have. But we have to come to grips with it. As of now, certainly, if you look at the demographic profiles, the UN projection is for the year 2100, something like at the lower bound of the projections. I'm going to look at the conservative projection, is about over 9 billion people. Okay, and we are now at about 7.8 billion. And the data, which we discuss at great length in the review, suggest that we really have a problem here. In some sense, in the Western world, the fertility rates are declining, as we know. Many of the Western European countries are now have fertility rates less than the sustainable left, or about 2.1 per household, number of children per woman of about 2.1. Africa is the source of a lot of problems for Africans, I mean. Not now. Africa is so poor that they don't really have an impact on the biosphere as a whole. We're looking at about 3 to 4% of global GDP is African GDP. So if you look at the left-hand side, the demand side, they have a very small impact. But the problem in Africa is their future. Is future for future Africans. I'm not talking about now the rest of us themselves. They're very poor. The fertility rate there is about 5.4 now, even though mortality rates have declined enormously. About 220 million women in their reproductive ages have expressed an unmet need for family planning. And we talk about empowering women, and we think the only way to empower them is to educate them or have built schools. An equally important way is actually to give them the facilities to have control over their bodies. In other words, family planning equipment, services. It can be done. Countries like Bangladesh have shown how it can be done. Their fertility rate is 2, and look where it is compared to Pakistan, where the fertility rate is about 3.4. Countries like Taiwan, South Korea met their fertility problems in about the 60s through really serious family planning programs, and look what they are now. Africa is not doing it, and we donor countries are ignoring it. The UK government has now cut the family planning budget to 0 this year. I think it's unconscionable.
Gosh.
So we have that continent has a serious problem, because the UN forecast, again lower end, is that Africa's population will be about 3.8 billion in the year 2100. That takes into account the reduction in fertility that will be predicted on the basis of education improvements. Okay. Now currently it's about 1 billion. So we're looking at from 1 to 3.8 billion increase. Now, the standard answer for their development will be export more and then invest. and now we're back to square one of what we've been discussing all this last 1 hour. They will be handing over wealth to the rich countries because of missing markets and creating farther and farther problems in terms of deforestation, desertification, you name it. Okay, and we are ignoring that. So the question about population, I'm so glad the person has asked, because it's very, very important and is totally ignored, even mostly by Africans, by the way. And maybe as a result, by Africans, I don't mean the common African. I really don't, please make it actually clear. We are looking at the elite who we're ignoring, both here and elsewhere. So I think there is something seriously difficult, the problem here, serious difficulty here. And if you really care about the poor person, which international development is supposed to target, then to ignore population in Africa and bits of South Asia and Middle East is really bad development prospect.
No, thank you very much for that. And you highlight within your report that low-income countries are there to lose the most. And I'm very pleased that I think it was Mariam who raised the question. I've got two final questions that I'm going to squeeze in, and I'll give them together so that you can take them in the order you see fit. One is from Robert Kenwood, who's been involved with the IUCN in collecting data on private payments for ecosystem services for recreational fishing and watching wildlife. And he's been involved with the EU on this. And he just wonders whether the new public payment for ecosystem services within the UK is going to be better at leveraging in private funding for that, rather better than in the EU. And a short, snappy question from Ian Davis. Is the World Trade Organization part of the problem or part of the solution?
I must say, this is delightful. All these questions have been delightful, including, of course, Mark, your own questions have been very perceptive, and it's been a pleasure. The first question, I mean, I really shouldn't comment because, of course, in principle, the answer is yes. Goes without saying. That's what this discussion has been leading up to. But some of the, the devil lies in the details, and I would be incompetent to comment on that. The World Trade Organization, one reason I sort of jumped at the opportunity of talking about wealth transfer from poor countries to rich countries is precisely that. I think the World Trade Organization has been deeply problematic in misusing economics. And they've misused economics because economics has misused, economists have misused economics. The idea that opening up trade is good for everyone is built on a hypothesis which requires a good deal of subtle economic reasoning. And that's been done already, not by me, but by forefathers, as it were, in the 50s and 60s, grains from trade. And it requires as an essential ingredient that every commodity that's being traded on has a market. Every commodity that's being traded and non-traded, all goods have a market, and they're competitive markets. Never mind the competitive part, but they all have markets. But of course, we are discussing a world in which so many markets are missing. So there's actually nothing, no intellectual ground for saying the moment you have opening up trade, things are good. Now, it is true that you can show correlation between growth in trade and growth in GDP. But then we are back to square one here. We're looking at provisioning services, and we are not looking at the degradation of the capital assets on which your estimate is being made, because GDP doesn't measure capital depreciation. It's gross domestic product. It doesn't say what's happening to the floor on which you're developing all the stuff. Okay, so the idea, the World Trade Organization really ought to take missing markets seriously. The point I just now made about wealth transfer should be taken seriously by them, trying to estimate what it is, and therefore attenuate the policies which encourage trade growth. This is not an anti-trade argument. It's an anti-development argument, anti-development argument. In other words, the the expansion of trade can be extremely harmful for poor countries, and I believe it has been in many cases, but it doesn't get recorded. Nobody knows because they are not being measured, as we've just now said. So the answer in my judgment is yes, the WTO is both a problem, source of a problem, as well as a solution in the sense that if they get their economics right, they can do wonders, because that's the kind of international organization we need. And I would say we need even more, because I was suggesting that we need international institution now to manage the global commons. Maybe not the trade organization, obviously it's not banned, but we do need to create one, the way the World Bank was created, the way the IMF was created to supply public goods at the end of the Second World War. Marshall Plan was in state. We need something like that in a big way now for the biosphere, protecting the biosphere, investing in the biosphere. But these are not on the table at the moment.
Well, Partha, thank you. We've come very sadly to the end of our hour. So, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, thank you very, very much indeed for giving up your time to be in conversation with me. I've been very lucky enough to interview you. And thank you so much for discussing the Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review. The link was put in the Q&A session. And please do visit our website for further information and to follow our series on natural capital, because it's an area that we as an association are looking very carefully at. And we also have a conference on Thursday, the 2nd of December in London, and we're going to be looking at creating a net zero carbon economy. So, Partha, thank you very much indeed for giving us. It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Bye-bye then.
Bye.